All right, thank you for coming. It means a lot to me, and I also want to thank Code and Supply for putting on this amazing conference. It gets better every year. So, this talk is called Teaching High School Computer Science as a Developer, and my name is Zack Whipkey. Gonna go over a little bit about myself real quick, but that's definitely not the focus. I'm a polyglot developer, so did Java, Node.js, C#, and I started in Pittsburgh actually working at places like UPMC and US Steel. And then I eventually moved to Austin, Texas, which led me to the volunteer opportunity I'm about to talk about. I started volunteering with TEALS beginning of the 2018 school year, and I got placed at an APCSA class at Austin High School. And a kind of important fact about me is that I grew up in the boonies near a little town called Waynesburg, south of here, and I had no pre-college comp sci education. There was one high school class that had programming, and the teacher left right before I was able to take it. So it was a pretty big bummer back then. But I want to ask you a question. When did you learn programming or computer science? If it was in high school, feel free to raise your hand. Awesome, that is impressively way more than I thought would be raising. What about college? Okay, cool, almost equal. And any totally self-taught people that just introduce themselves that way. Awesome, cool. So a little bit of a variance, but it looked like 40%, 50% high school, 40% college, and 10% self-taught. Awesome. So what is this talk actually about? Well, first I'm going to go over why you should consider teaching. And I want to stress that I mean volunteer teaching. I'm not advocating for anybody to go full-time into K-12 teaching. I have various reasons for that, but won't go into them. The second is the differences between teaching a high school student and teaching a junior engineer, or mentoring one. There's quite a few differences, and we'll also go into how you can use a few specific tips to teach high school students. And the cool, unique part of this presentation is with my class, I did a special trial of teaching source control, which is kind of a topic that you don't always get taught in college or high school, so it was interesting. We'll go into that later. So why teach? The first thing is knowledge. You confirm so much knowledge by teaching a topic, and I found myself, especially with the low-level stuff of computer science, just relearning a lot of things. So one specific example was I was going over Java and string literals, and they are allocated in memory a kind of special way compared to like a new object. So I made a wrong assumption and had to quickly correct myself and reteach myself. It's a good bit of humility then. And the cool thing about teaching is that students ask the weirdest questions from different angles, and they will remove any sort of self-deceit that you had about yourself. The second is paying it forward. So this kind of goes into the whole open source initiative of sharing, providing stuff for free. And I actually got into this volunteer opportunity through my therapist. I was talking with her about how I was really burned out and kind of had lost a little bit of my purpose, and I was just going through the motions. And I kind of mentioned that I always wanted to teach in a nonprofit sort of way. I had done boot camps and stuff, but it's a little bit more for-profit, and it didn't feel as good. So she suggested that I look for volunteer opportunities, and that was how I got with TEALS. And this is kind of personal for me too, because I didn't have that opportunity in high school to take computer science. So this is a way for me to provide that to others. The third point is empathy. And this is probably the strongest point. These kids usually are learning from ground zero, right? They have not done programming before in a lot of cases, or they have a very small amount. So you've been working with others that have been doing programming for a while, and you get used to that, and you make assumptions every day when you're working with them. So you really got to kind of step back into their perspective, remember when you started, and tailor your teaching and your understanding to that. And you get way more empathetic that way. The next point is kind of weird. You might ask, well, how do you network via teaching high school? And the thing I found out is that other volunteers, really, you connect with them, you talk about the obstacles that you're going through in your classrooms, and if you ever find yourself needing a job, you can always reach out to one of them, and they'll help you out because you're in this, initiative together trying to do a good thing. So it's kind of a nice benefit. And the last point, the point that I don't know much about, parenting. I don't have any children, but I like to think that I can make the educated guess that teaching helps you teach your own child. So I think this is kind of neat, and if I had a child, I would love to be able to help them along without frustrating them and whatnot. So wrapping that up, I wanted to talk about TEALS. So TEALS has one mission, and that mission is computer science in every high school. Currently, they have about 494 schools enrolled across about 27 states and about 8,000 students, AP. In the 2017 to 2018 school year, those students were mostly 33% women and 34% underrepresented minorities. So I like to think this does a great deal for diversity. I like to think there's a trickle effect where the earlier you introduce these concepts to somebody, the better they're willing to actually choose this field in the long term. The longer you wait, I think people get more resistant to changing. So I think this is doing great work. And this is sponsored by Microsoft, Philanthropies specifically, which means that it's legit. There's resources for you. There's regional managers all across the US. And they have lesson plans. You can do summer training. I think we did 3 weekends or 3 Saturdays. And it really helps you out. There's different levels of volunteer commitment, which you can do remote. You can do full-on co-teaching where you're helping out the lesson plans every week. It's a pretty heavy commitment. I definitely advise looking into it first. And then there's stuff like TAing, as I did, and classroom enrichment. So before we go into kind of the nitty-gritty of this, I wanted to establish a quick baseline of what mentoring and guiding a junior engineer actually looks like. So first is base level knowledge. You interview the person, you hire them. Hopefully they know how to do the job. Hopefully there's not like a weird red flag or anything. So you can kind of make a lot of assumptions right then. The second that's kind of different from high school is risk. You don't have to worry about high school students blowing up production. So it's not that big of a deal. Whereas a junior engineer, there's a really interesting case that was posted on Reddit a while back where a junior engineer accidentally deleted the production Postgres database. And the company had no backups. So they fired him. I don't think that's the standard across many companies. I really hope not. But it's a risk I wanted to point out anyways. Students will not be, they might explode their computer, lock it up, but that's the most they can do. The third point is actually the most similar. So time and resources, you might not have a ton of time with your current job priorities to help out that junior engineer. A lot of companies tend to underestimate the amount of time it takes to onboard somebody. And it's kind of similar in high school, really. You have a certain class period, it goes by super fast. And you're like left with your lesson plan, or the lesson for that day, like 70% done. And you're like, okay, well now I have to push back the next class to make sure everybody understands it. So kind of similar there. And the last point I wanted to touch quickly, how standardized are your company's processes? If the code base is full of anti-patterns, you have to go and explain those weird intricacies to the junior engineer. The less you have of that, the better. And I like to think that's what you will also want to do in high school. You want to stick to one language at first. Don't go throwing a ton of different languages because there's different syntax, and syntax is always hard to get going at first. So, moving on to actually teaching at a high school level. So again, base level knowledge, much lower than junior level engineer. A lot of folks are just not going to have programming level knowledge, so you really need to go through, okay, what is a variable? How does a loop work? And a lot of the other building blocks of programming. And this is where empathy comes in a lot. And also the fact that you're going to be aiming for the middle of the class. What I mean by that is that there's going to be outliers. There's going to be people that really get the material, and there's going to be people that are falling behind. And you have to try to average it out the best that you can, and then give one-on-one attention to the outliers usually. All right, does anybody know what this animal is? Yes, awesome. So why this is relevant is one of the tactics for helping spread out knowledge and making sure that everybody is kind of taken care of is you act like a meerkat. And meerkats have this behavior where they're investigating something and then they quickly perk up and check the surroundings. And this is similar to what you want to do as a teacher or a teacher's assistant. You want to see each student, check in, even if they don't ask, help ensure that all students receive support. And you can ask an open-ended question like, what's going on, what are you working on? You're not going to spend a ton of time with them. It's mostly a minute. And that at least keeps them attentive because you're paying attention, you're coming by, making sure that they're working. And it gives them the ability to ask for help for a heavier one-on-one time later on. And it tends to work out pretty great for labs. Attention and enthusiasm is the biggest difference I found between working with a junior engineer. Junior engineer is there to get paid, right? They're working. If they don't pay attention or are at least a little bit enthusiastic, they're probably going to get fired eventually, and that's bad because you have no income. High school's a little bit different, right? Students may be interested in computer science, so they sign up. And they may have a great big misconception about what computer science is. You do Hello World, and many students who have been working with an iPad since age 5 or 7 they might not think it's that great. And they might also think it's hard. So enthusiasm can drop. And that's something you kind of have to deal with. And attention is really hard to maintain in high school. The fact that you're dealing with computers and the amount of stuff you can look up and play. I had a ton of students in front of me that were playing video games during class or getting on YouTube. And there's a few mechanisms you can do to kind of prevent this. But with a junior engineer, you usually don't expect that to happen too often. So one of the tactics you can do is, the one I prefer is actually at the top. It's one teach, one support. And I would have the high school teacher doing his lecture at the front, and then I would kind of rotate between different perspectives where I would usually be able to see the computer screens. And I had this weird effect at first where the students didn't really know me that well because I was a new volunteer, and to them it was like this guy who's here to help us is able to see our screens now, and now I don't want to play a game anymore, or now I don't want to go on YouTube. So able to kind of promote them paying attention. And I can also let the teacher know later on if a student is just blatantly not paying attention. And there's also different ones you can see here. Team teaching, station teaching. I haven't done too much of these, but they each have their own disadvantages and advantages. Debugging. Debugging is the hardest thing I found for students to get. It's kind of different from anything they've done before. And there's a couple of reasons for this. There's a great tweet by Scott Hanselman, who did the keynote last time at Abstractions. It says, non-technical people, here's the secret. We tech folks have no idea what the problem is. We just try to narrow it down, removing variables. And that's what I found debugging to be a lot of times. You have a stack trace, you have an error message, but it's not exactly clear what you need to do. It's just the computer's interpretation of a problem. So you need to be really careful about helping out a student during a debugging session, because you don't want to just do it for them. You need to kind of guide them through it. To do this, you have to do the Socratic method, which is, how does this work? And by asking this, you get them to give their interpretation of the problem. This is important because you might assume that they are thinking about it a certain way when they're not. They're misunderstanding something else entirely. So this helps you get to what they're actually misunderstanding. At that point, you can ask leading questions to try to get them taking action, heading towards a solution. And then you can hopefully give an actionable next step and go on to the next student, because you can't really spend many minutes at a time with each student. Getting past failure. So failure is something hard that you don't really run into like you do in computer science. Besides math, I don't think there's any other high school topic where it hits you in the face as hard. You know, your code doesn't compile, a bug is just super hard to get through. So you tend to hit failure a lot. And if anybody watched Ali Spittle's talk yesterday on teaching, she had a great graph. It was kind of like a curve. And it starts with an uninformed optimism, which means that students are expecting to do great and get through it really fast. And then you hit down into this area called the pit of despair, which I love the name. And the hard part is getting the student to get out of that, because it's promoting this growth mindset that they can get out of it. With enough grit and determination, you will find the bug. There's still times today as a developer where I'll be stuck on a bug for a day or two. It's rough sometimes. You just want to give up. But that's part of programming and computer science. You just got to stick with it. And also times have kind of changed. And decades ago, you were able to take a magazine and put all the code on a page into your Commodore 64 and make a game. Pretty awesome. You can't really do that today. I mean, maybe with like an indie game or tic-tac-toe, but the scale has just gotten so much grander. So students have been seeing this for a while, and as I mentioned earlier, they might not be impressed by Hello World, and they might want to move super fast, and it can be discouraging. But getting through this point of failure and getting up into the growth mindset, which is at the end of that chart basically, is the belief that this notion that their abilities are not fixed, that they can get past it, they can learn things. And this is almost imperative, I think, to become a programmer or a computer scientist. And there's kind of this myth that hurts this growth mindset, which is the geek gene. There's been so many studies, I have them linked here, that kind of disprove this. There's no nature aspect, in my opinion, to learning programming computer science. There is, some advantages if you, grow up with a CS parent or somebody else to help you. It helps, but nothing is really full-on blocking you. And Carol Dweck from Stanford actually termed this concept. She has a lot of content on it. So the unique part of this presentation, which is, can you teach source control at a high school level? But first off, again, I want to ask, when did you learn source control? Was it in college? Awesome. High school, anybody in high school learned source control? Wow.
Is making a complete copy of a file source
Yeah, that's source control in my opinion. Awesome. And how many was self-taught or taught on the job? Okay, wow. Resounding yes. So good. I'm happy to see it's kind of what I suspected. All right. So the goal was to teach basic Git. Basic is really important here. In a way that interests students and accomplishes something cool. And I wanted to keep the lesson length around 2 hours or 2 classes. These AP classes have one objective, which is to prepare students for the AP exam. So I don't have a lot of wiggle room with trying to get this kind of trial run or auxiliary learning in. And I want to emphasize basic Git. You might have seen this XKCD comic before, around people basically just memorizing certain Git commands, and that works for them. Something explodes, they back up their changes, destroy it, clone again, and then toss them back in. Hoping the students wouldn't have to do that, but I didn't want to get into git bisect, cherry picking, anything crazy. So the plan was GitHub Pages. Now, if you don't know what GitHub Pages is, it's kind of a really easy to use way of having a website. And the way it works is you push markup files or markdown files, HTML, plain old text, and it just appears on Git's DNS or domain, and really easy to use. You push the master and it appears. So students were actually pretty excited by creating a website. When you can share something with your parent or your friends, it's pretty exciting. And especially when you get to work together on something. And I chose GitHub Pages 2 because HTML is pretty easy. It's a markdown language, and I provided it with a template, just put a span here, put a div here, play around with it. And it worked out pretty well. I have a lesson guide on GitHub. It's not 100% finished, but I plan on doing it over the weekend. And I was able to kind of showcase merge conflicts a lot easier rather than having like Java or JavaScript. So how'd it go? Basically like this. This was me in the first class. The reason why is that GitHub Desktop was 64-bit only, and a lot of the school laptops were only 32-bit. So I just killed my plan right out the window. And admin rights gave me some issues with Git. I had to pivot to using GitHub's web editor, which is actually a lot better than I thought. It turned out to be a good backup. So it wasn't the most fluid lesson, but we were able to succeed. So this is a straight up image of their website. You notice there is no line breaks. All just a run-on sentence. But the students had fun. They each got to have some of their own content in there. And you see the words dinosaur nuggets. I don't know who put that in there. But finishing up. This is kind of a downer in a way, what I'm about to talk about, but there's also a bright side to it. So I think it's kind of common knowledge that teachers don't get paid a lot. It's really stressful. It's not exactly regarded as the best job, but it is extremely rewarding to do. Computer scientists, or people that can program, usually are making a decent salary, right? So my question is, how do you keep teachers with the skills to teach this material teaching? And is the love for it strong enough? I don't know the answer to this question, and I personally, like I said earlier, would not be a full-time teacher, but it's an issue that kind of makes the TEALS initiative not exactly permanent, right? We can train teachers, but they might leave eventually. And I don't know how to solve this problem. The clear one is like raise teacher salaries, and there's a lot of obstacles to that, right? But there is one upside to this, is that we can make a difference. The volunteers are needed. If you're willing to contribute, an hour or two of your time a week, you can help out a class. And sometimes that's all that's needed to make a difference. So that's my talk. Thank you so much for coming. If anybody wants to talk to me about TEALS in general, or Austin or anything else, feel free. And yeah, thank you.